Hello, class, and welcome to the Emergence of American Culture Part 2. This time we're going to focus on two cultural movements, the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening from about 1720 to 1763. Both of these movements are going to have some sort of impact on American culture, American identity. So the big idea, what you should be able to prove, what you're going to learn in this lecture, is that the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening helped shape American identity. And hopefully at the end of that, you'll have some evidence you can prove that that is in fact true. So let's first start by talking a little bit about the period of Great Britain in the mercantile system. We discussed the mercantile system in class when we talked about this is basically triangular trade. So we discussed this in class a little bit. But while Great Britain was immersed in the mercantile system and enforcing triangular trade in the colonies, Great Britain, other than forcing the colonies to trade with British merchants, pretty much left the colonies alone to kind of govern themselves. And this time period, when Great Britain kind of left the colonies alone, it's called salutary neglect, or voluntarily kind of neglecting someone, a friendly relationship but leaving you alone. And during this period here, Great Britain allowed colonial assemblies to pass laws without the British government's consent. Most of these laws were related to taxes, colonial taxes, and a lot of them had to do with religious laws. But for the most part, the British Parliament, the British government, allowed colonial assemblies to pass laws without their consent. During this time period, most colonies also had a representative government, or we're talking about elected people that made these laws for them. So during this period, the colonies were getting very, very, very used to, and when we say colonies, we are talking primarily about white men who owned land. Okay, so white men who owned land in the colonies were getting very, very used to having representative government as part of their colonial life, or having a say in the types of taxes and the rules about religion and culture that were going on in their colony. Okay, and so because of that, when an intellectual movement in Europe made its way over to the colonies, via books, came over in books, and people started to read about it. It took hold in the colonies, and a lot of the ideas became popular amongst those white land-owning men who could vote. And that movement was called the Enlightenment. So it was a European intellectual movement, and it focused on questioning the natural world. Basically, before people really started to investigate the environment and the world and through the scientific method, people explained occurrences in the world through religion. So the story that my parents used to tell me when I was a kid, when there was a thunderstorm and we heard thunder, my mom would say, "Oh, that was St. Michael. He got a strike. The angels are bowling." And so, until I was about six years old, I thought that thunder was the angels bowling. And then I found out that no, that's not really what thunder is. Thunder has an actual natural reason. It has a scientific reason for why it occurs. So it's not a religious reason, but there is science and reason involved in thunder and lightning. And so rather than trying to explain occurrences in the world, why things happen through religion, during the Enlightenment, people started to do scientific research and use reason to explain why things happen, and not just these religious answers that people had before. In addition to that, in addition to questioning the natural world and things that were going on in the environment, philosophers started to question systems of government. And most importantly, this question, why were certain people chosen to rule as kings? Again, the old answer was religion, that God chose them to be kings. But as people started to figure out that maybe it's not, God hasn't caused everything to happen in our world. God doesn't cause lightning. There's a scientific reason behind it. Maybe kings aren't the best form of government. Okay, and so this sort of philosophy, this sort of thinking, took hold in the colonies and became popular amongst the educated, particularly white land-owning men. So some of the philosophies that the Enlightenment preached, or that Enlightenment philosophers wrote about, was that men should elect their leaders. And again, this was really this was happening for the most part in the colonies. Again, white landowning men were allowed to elect most of their leaders in the colony. The powers of the government should be written down in a constitution. Again, that was the case in most colonies. If we think back to Massachusetts, there's the Mayflower Compact. If we think about Connecticut, there was the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. So this sort of process was already happening in many of the colonies. Another one of the philosophies was that humans have natural rights. And these are rights that you have simply because you're born a human. And that's life, liberty, and property. So you have the right to live. You have the right to freedom in some sort of a sense. And we'll talk about what that means as we move forward. And you have the right to own property. And again, this is particularly important with white land-owning men who feel that they should have the right to protect the property and have rules and have a voice in how that property is taxed and how that property is used and who has control over that property. And finally, humans should use thought and reason to explain natural occurrences, not religion. And again, this was already happening in the colonies as people did scientific research. So why would the Enlightenment become popular in the English colonies? Well, there are a few really key reasons. Number one, public education was popular in the colonies, and particularly in New England. As we'll see when we move forward a little bit and look at some of our sources, we'll see that public education was actually required in all of the New England colonies. So all kids had to go to school until they were about 12 years old, and they learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and they also learned moral values, and we'll look at that in some greater detail. There's access to books in the colonies. Benjamin Franklin started a library system in Philadelphia, and pretty soon most large cities and even some small towns had a library system where you could go and borrow a book and read and then return it. It was essentially the internet of the 1750s. It made access to information possible. People could simply read. Most colonists didn't consider the king their ruler. By the time the Enlightenment became popular in the colonies, we're talking, this is like, the 1720s-ish. Most people that were living in the colonies were actually born there. So they had never been to England. They didn't know the king. They only had ever seen pictures of him, perhaps in a newspaper. So they didn't call themselves necessarily a subject. They felt that they were more a citizen of Maryland or Pennsylvania or Massachusetts. And finally, there was a case in New York called the John Peter Zenger trial about free speech. John Peter Zenger, he questioned some of the actions of the New York royal governor in a newspaper. And the royal governor had John Peter Zenger arrested. And they held a trial because English law requires that before you're sentenced to prison or death or whatever. And in the trial, John Peter Zenger said, look, I didn't print anything that was false. I just simply disagreed with what the royal governor was doing. And he said, that's, as an Englishman, I should have the right to free speech. And the court in New York agreed with him. And they said that, yes, newspaper writers, so we're talking about newspapers and printed media like that, are allowed to use free speech. As long as what you're saying is true, then you can print it, even if not everybody likes it. And so that was something that was kind of unique in the colonies and in England as well, compared to the rest of Europe, where you didn't have free speech. If the king didn't like what you were saying in France or in Spain, then you could be put in jail or possibly put to death if it was bad enough. So at the same time that the Enlightenment was occurring, there was also another movement going on in the colonies that was contrary to it. So the Enlightenment was all about using reason and science and trying to figure out the natural world based on those things. The Great Awakening was a religious revival to counteract the Enlightenment. There were a lot of preachers that started looking at the Enlightenment and say, whoa, wait a minute here. It's God that does everything in our world. God makes all our decisions, not human beings. And so a lot of these preachers started to try to, remind people that, hey, wait a minute, don't turn away from the church. Don't turn away from religion. Come back, because really it's religion that's going to determine your fate, not your thought and your reason and science. And so a lot of these preachers created new American churches that emphasized old values. So they're new churches, but they bring back this old idea of predestination. And we also get a new American Christianity emerging out of it that kind of combines enlightenment and reasoning. And we call that deism. The idea that there is a God, but he does not control the universe. So we kind of get these two new schools of churches out of the Great Awakening in reaction to the Enlightenment. The first school, this is kind of your old school style of thought that said the Enlightenment is bogus, don't listen to it, it's predestination that and God that's going to determine your fate. And then there's sort of the new school that says, yeah, there is a God, but you know what? He actually doesn't control the universe. And we should still worship him, and we should still go to church, and that's still a valuable part of our life, but it shouldn't be the only part of our life. Okay? So the Great Awakening has this effect on America, where we start to get these new churches. Some of them are old school thought, and some of them are new school thought, but in general, they're new American churches that are not associated with England in any way. So you wouldn't find these churches in England. You only find them in America. So as you look at listen to what I did, go back, take a look at your notes. You want to rewind the lecture, but see if you can prove that statement on the slide right there is true. The Enlightenment and the Great Awakening helped shape American identity. So when you look at these two movements, right, and we think about American identity in the 1700s, right? What sorts of things did these two movements contribute to the American culture and American identity during that time period? Take some time to write it down. And then if you want to go on to the PowerPoint, if you've printed it out and you have it in front of you, take a look at some of these key terms that I talked about in the last two lectures and see if you can match them with their proper descriptions. Again, this is a little bit of basic knowledge, something we need a little bit of practice with. So take a few moments and see if you can do that. So two things. Can you prove that this is true? Write down some ideas related to the Enlightenment, Great Awakening, shaping American identity, and do a little practice with basic knowledge. And we'll see you in class. Thanks for watching.